let's begin by saying that the source of our learning should be to help bring the hostages home and to protect our soldiers and to protect Am Yisrael and all of the innocents and bring a speedy end to this war.
Amen.
Amen. And with that, let's go back into the Gemara that we left 2 weeks ago. And we actually got, just to remind you, we got to the very end of this part here. I'm not going to jump right into the end because we didn't do it for 2 weeks. I don't know if you've reviewed it. So let's do a quick review just to put it in context. And the context is we're going way back here, where the Mishnah told us that Hashotem Lo Lugmav is chayav for drinking on Yom Kippur. So we had this Ma'amar of Shmuel who explained that Melo Lugmav means that the liquid is all pushed to one side. It's not really literally both cheekfuls, it's one very full cheek. And so then we had some back and forth about that. But ultimately we seem to uphold the definition of Shmuel that Melo Lugmav means that it's enough liquid that's in your mouth, and if you push it to one side, it fills up your cheek. So then we asked a series of kashas. The Gemara asked a series of kashas. And we're going to pick up from here. Maskifla Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Zera attacks this whole concept. He attacks the concept that is put out by the Mishnah, that the Mishnah differentiates between the shear for drinking and the shear for eating by saying that the shear for drinking is a relative shear, and the shear for eating is an absolute shear. Maskifla Rabbi Zera, Ma'ishna Achila, the kol chad v'chad b'kikotevet, Ma'ishna Shtiya, the kol chad v'chad b'didei. What's the difference? In other words, why should I differentiate between the shear for eating, where for every person, no matter who they are, no matter what their size is, they're going to be chayav for eating the amount of a kikotevet, whereas for each person, the amount they'll be chayav for drinking is going to depend on the size of their cheek. So Marle Abaye said to him, Kilu Rabbanan b'kikotevet mahachim yat v'date. So Abaye says, this is what was established to the Rabbanan, that a kikotevet is enough to put one's mind at ease on Yom Kippur, but sir mehachi lo miyatva. And less than a kikotevet isn't enough to put your mind at ease, but b'shtiyah, b'didei miyat v'date, b'dechavrei lo miyat v'date. The Rabbanan knew that when it came to drinking, it's going to depend on the size of that person's cheek, how much they can hold in their cheek. So
it just repeats what it doesn't solve. It doesn't give doesn't answer the question.
Well,
just repeats it.
Well, so in a sense that's true. But what does he add? There's only one thing that he's adding that Rabbi Zera didn't take into account. There's only one thing. In other words, your question is, Rabbi Zera asked a question, what's the difference between a kikotevet that's an absolute shear? Why should I differentiate between eating to give it an absolute shear and for drinking that I give it a relative shear? So what's Abaye's answer?
It's based on this idea of yeshuva dat mitzvah data.
So first of all, he says it's all related to the idea of yeshuva dat and kim lahu l'Rabbanan. This is something that the Rabbanan knew. In other words, he's not giving, what Paul is saying is true in the sense that he's not giving a svara, he's not giving a reason, like a logical reason as such, but he's giving a halachic reason. The halachic reason is that this is something that the rabbis knew.
Well, this Rabbi Zera also knew that. Of course, he knows that it comes that this was the decision of Rabbanan, but he's asking why did Rabbanan? What was their reason to decide that way?
You're assuming that Rabbi Zera would have made that differentiation himself, but I'm not. Maybe not. Maybe Rabbi Zera is saying, So first, let's think about it for a second. There are two possibilities. Either he knew the same thing, but he asked because he wants a deeper reason, and Abai is telling him there is no deeper reason that we know. In other words, we don't have access to anything deeper than this, but this is sufficient. It's sufficient to know that the Rabbanan had this as a received tradition. Kimlahu Rabbanan. This is something that they knew. This is something that was established to them. And but if you take that in combination with the point that Michael makes, it's again, I can't say more than what the Gemara is saying, but the Gemara seems to be pointing to this idea that the Rabbanan understood that when it comes to Yishuv Hadat, there is a difference between the way we relate individually to drinking and the way we relate individually to eating. And I don't know if you can prove that empirically, but this is Kimlahu Rabbanan. This is what the Rabbanan knew. And
it
that
sounds like Lama Kacha.
But
I can think of a reason.
Yeah.
Yes. Because when you eat, you can take this. How do they call this? This koteret, yes. This is you do have such an object, more or less, yes. But if you don't have an don't have milliliters to measure a quantity of water or something of liquid, how would you do it? You need some standard vessel, and you don't have a standard vessel at that time. So your mouth is some kind of standard vessel.
Okay, I'm not sure that that's the case.
But I could. This would be an answer at least.
No, but I don't think
a reasonable answer.
I don't think it's a good answer because they did have standard measures at the time. Because, for example, for drinking, for let's say being yotzei, drinking wine on Leil HaSeder.
Revi'it, yes. Revi'it of what? What is this Revi'it? I don't know.
Okay, but so Revi'it tahin. So the people knew how big that is. If you want to know how big it is now, so they're different day out. Like we measure it now in milliliters. So it would be, let's say, on the small side, it would be, let's say, 75 milliliters, and some people hold it's almost 3 times that much. But Bonagid, that for like the people had standard sizes then also. So I would say that's Lav Dafka. I think it's pointing. The way I've always understood this part of the Gemara, though, is that always, as much as I've been thinking about it, there's something qualitatively different about having your mouth fill up with liquid. I don't know. In other words, maybe the answer is simply the answer really is Kimlahu Rabbanan. This is something that the Rabbanan knew, And you can ask yourself if you think that's true for yourself. I don't know, but this is something that they had. But this is that there's Yishuv Hadat by filling up your mouth with water or whatever you're drinking. Okay. In any event, Bonagid. This was Rabbi Zera's kasha, and this is Abaye's answer. Abaye's answer is Kimuhu Rabbanan. Maskifla Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Zera asks kasha again. V'chol ha'olam kulo b'kichotevet, v'og melech habashan b'kikotevet. So the entire world is with a kikotevet, and Og Melech HaBashan is with a kikotevet. What's his kasha? What's his question?
We had already established that Ogamelech is like out of the ordinary. So a normal person is satisfied with a kuktevet. So Ogamelech Bashan, in comparing it to drinking, should not be get Yeshua da from the kuktevet. I'm sorry, it's a bit messed up.
In other words, right. So in other words, the argument that Abaye put forth a moment ago is that, okay, when it comes to eating, there's an absolute measure. So Rabbi Zera says, how does this absolute measure work? Your claim, Abaye, is that there's an absolute measure for eating, and that brings about Yishuv Hadat. So how can it be that an average person will get Yishuv Hadat from a kikotevet, but a giant will also get Yishuv Hadat from a kikotevet? In other words, how can it be that we don't take into account the size of the person when it comes to eating? We do take that into account for drinking, because for drinking, it's a relative measure based on the size of the person. How can it be that for eating, we don't say that there's also a relative aspect involved? So Amale Abaye says, Kimuhu Rabbanan de Bahachamiyat Vedate. He gives the same answer, but he gives a little bit more detail. This is what the Rabbanan knew, that a person gets Yishuv Hadat from Kikotevet. Less than that, Batzi Mahachi no miyat Vedate. He doesn't get Yishuv Hadat from less than that. Mihu, nonetheless, Kule Alma Tuva. The whole world, in other words, generally, most people will get a lot of Yishuv Hadat from eating a Kikotevet. And Og Melech HaBashan, Purta. For Og Melech HaBashan, if a giant eats a Kikotevet, he'll get a little bit.
He wasn't a Jew.
He wasn't a Jew. So as we said,
no, I understand what they mean, but
yeah.
The example
Right.
is quite hilarious. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Chazal also had a sense of humor. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, they weren't really concerned about Og Melech HaBashan eating on Yom Kippur, but there is a reality that some people are much bigger. Mm-hmm. So they say that you still get a little bit of Yishuv Hadat from eating the Kikotevet. Okay. And then we have the next question of Rabbi Zera along similar lines. Maskifla Rabbi Zera, Basar Shamen b'kikotevet, v'loveg fanim b'kikotevet. Right? Fatty meat is measured with a kikotevet, and grape leaves are also measured with kikotevet. So what? And what's his question now?
Fatty meat is like serious food, and grape sprouts are rabbit food, as they say.
So in other words, the reason Rabbi Zera is asking these questions, as I understand it, again, when we're talking about eating and drinking on Yom Kippur, our whole approach is different than any other kind of Isur of Achila. Other kinds of Isurei Achila, we're concerned with what the definition of Achila is. But here, we're really concerned not with the definition of Achila in a limited sense, but rather in this sense of what gives a person Yishuv Hadat, what will break them from not being mi'uneh, what will break their inui nefesh on Yom Kippur. So Rabbi Zera says, look, if you eat basar shamen, if you eat some fatty meat, if you eat a kotevet of fatty meat, that's bound to give you more Yishuv Hadat than if you eat a lot of grape leaves, if you eat a lot of lettuce, even if it's the same amount of food. Right, and so this is something that we know bechush, right? We know this ourselves. Even if you love salad, if you sit down and you eat a big pile of salad, it's not going to, I don't know, it's not going to fill you in the same way as if you eat something, like a high protein or fatty thing like basar shamin. And again, Rabbi Zer is saying, you're telling me that this is all about Yishuv Hadat. So how can you compare? In other words, the argument would be that, okay, Nagid, that you have an absolute shear of Kikotevet. In other words, he's accepted this idea that you have an absolute shear of a Kikotevet, but nonetheless, shouldn't we differentiate between different kinds of foods? So Amar Le'abai, Kimu Rabbanan, the Bahachi Miata Adate. Says the same thing. Rabbanan also held that this is, you get Yishuv Hadad from eating Kikotevet of whatever you eat. And less than that, you don't get Yishuv Hadad. Miu Basar Shamein Tuva. If you eat Basar Shamein, then you get a lot of Yishuv Hadad. If you eat the Levek Fanim, Porta, you get a little bit of Yishuv Hadad. But nonetheless, either way, you get Yishuv Hadat. So that's the answer. Now we get up to the part that we.
It's just some.
Sure.
Maybe I think we talked about it. Well, how much time do you have to wait between the shiurim? You take one and then you take another one. This could be very important. And they didn't have watches.
They didn't have watches, but this is exactly the part that we're going to get up to now.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
So now, Maskifla Rava. Rava asked a question. Until now, this is Rabbi Zera asking, and Abaye keeps pushing back. Now Rava asks, and he says, "Kizayit ichdei achilat pras, v'kotevet ichdei achilat pras." Eating a kazayit in the time it takes to eat achilat pras, and eating kotevet in the time it takes to eat achilat pras. So what's his question? What's he asking? Paul, this is not exactly what you're asking, but it's very germane to what you're asking. So when do we measure eating a kazayit b'chdei achilat pras?
It's for most mitzvot involved with eating, either in a sur or you need to eat. For example, the amount of matzah you need to eat on Pesach.
Okay, so here for the purpose of this discussion, let's talk about in terms of isur, right? So if you eat a kazayit of chelev, right, of fat that's forbidden for you to eat. If you eat a kazayit of treif meat, So when are you chayev? If you eat that kazayit in the time it takes to eat a chilat pras. And we're also saying that in order for you to be chayav for eating on Yom Kippur, you eat a kikotevet bichdei achilat pras. So once again, to remind ourselves, which is bigger, the kazayit or the kikotevet?
The Kikotevet.
כותרת.
The kikotevet is much bigger.
Mhm.
So to put Rava in Rava's question in slightly different terms, he's saying, how can it be that we measure the time it takes for eating an isur, any other isur achila, which we measure in size as a kazayid, that you have to eat that within kedei achilat pras? How can it be that we use the same measure of time for eating the kikotevet? What measure of time would it make? Would we think would make more sense?
Larger than Achilat Paras.
Say that again.
Larger than, longer than Achilat Pras.
Right. In other words, if granted that I understand that on Yom Kippur I'm going to measure the Isur Achila in Kikotevet and not Kazayit. You have to eat more on Yom Kippur in order to be Chayav. But why should I measure that using the same time measure as I do for any other Isur? Because I could say that, if you eat a Kikotevet in a longer span of time, you should still be Chayav. Amar le Abaye, Kilahu Rabbanan de Bahachim Yat V'Date. B'tfei Mehachi Lo Miyat V'Date. So Abaye says the Rabbanan knew that in that amount of time, eating a kokotevet b'chdei achilat pras, that's what gives yishuv hadat. But more than that, in other words, eating a kokotevet in a longer time span than kedei achilat pras doesn't give yishuv hadat. So Abaye remains very consistent in his answer. And we have some things to talk about now, but we'll go back and discuss some of the other underlying themes in a moment. But first, we're going to digress. It's not exactly a digression, it's more, background. We're going to learn Rashi here. In order to learn Rashi here, as I pointed out a couple of weeks ago, we have to put together a couple of other sources to understand how these shiurim come into play. So Rashi says, "Kizai b'chtei achilat pras." So he says, "Kimlan b'chol otan isurin sheshiuran b'kizait." It's established to us, in other words, we know, Chazal knew about all of these other isurin that are measured by a kazayit. She'im shaha ben tchilat achilat hashiur ligmar achilato yoter bichdei achilat pras. But if he took the amount of time from the beginning of the eating of that shiur until he finished eating that shiur, more than the time it takes to eat a pras, ein mitzaref, then the what he ate doesn't join together to make the shear of kazayit. Ad shilchal kol hashiur b'toch kedei shehiyat suda. He has to eat the entire shear of the kazayit in the amount of time it takes to eat a suda. And what is that? Hi achilat chatzi kikar. It's eating half of a loaf. Shishia rubo et eruv. That Chazal measured with it the eruv. Shehu mazon shtei sudot. And that's the amount of food, really like the amount of bread for 2 meals. Keditnan chetzia v'bayit hamenuga, shetala hakatuv shehiyato l'tamei begadim b'shiur achila. So Rashi is compressing a lot of stuff into this comment. So in order to explain the comment, let's go and look at a couple of things that will help us to understand this Rashi and thereby to understand, hopefully, the source material for Kedei Achilat Pras. So let's take a look here. This is the Mishnah in Eruvin Perek Chet, and the Mishnah here. There are two things. There are basically 2 things that we're going to want to look at. What mainly we're going to look here in Eruvin to understand this idea of Mazon Shtei Sudot and why it was significant in Eruvin, and how that relates also to Bayit HaMenuga, and with the house that has a nega, and what that has to do with the shear of eating. We'll look at that second. First, let's look at this. Ketzad mishtatfim batchumin. So this is the Mishnah says, talks about shitufei tchumin, or eruvei tchumin. So what's an eruv tchum? Anybody?
Is it Tchum Shabbat or what do you mean here?
Tchum Shabbat. So what was the eruv? What was an eruv l'gabei tchum Shabbat?
Some separation, like today they use a chut.
Not exactly.
It could also be a small wall, something. A wall.
No, no. Michael Schwartz, did you want to say?
Yeah, I think they're combining places so that the public places and treating them as a private place so that you can carry in it privately, because you can carry in a Reshut Yachid, but not in a Reshut Rabim. So they're making that out of the private places.
Okay, you're both really talking about Eruvei Chatzerot. When we talk about Eruv Tchumin, we're talking about a different reality. So the idea of Eruv, right? Eruv Chatzer is is the idea that you had people who all shared a common Chatzer, and that houses were built in a kind of a block with an open Chatzer, the way we see here in older parts of Yerushalayim, like in Nachlaot and in Mea Sha'arim. You have houses that go like around in a kind of a block form, and then everybody shares a common chatzer. So in order to allow people to carry in and out of their homes into the common chatzer, there would be an eruv chatzerot, which meant simply that food was put into one of the houses that everybody in principle could share, and it made it for Shabbat as if all of their houses in the Chatzer were one reshut. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Eruv Tchumin. So what's Eruv Tchumin? So when you have a city you're not allowed to walk out of the city. This isn't about carrying, this is simply about walking. You're not allowed to walk outside of the city more than 2,000 amot in any direction. And in fact, because cities are not built in perfect squares, but there's a way where you look at the city, you look at the map of the city, and essentially you square it off on a map. It's a theoretical square. And then you're not allowed to walk more than 2,000 amot in any directions beyond that square. But what if you needed to get someplace that's further than 2,000 amot in one direction? So there's a heter for you to do that by making an eruv tchum. And it's a similar idea, but the idea is that you would go on Erev Shabbat, you would take food and put it, let's say you want to go 4,000 amot in one direction. So you would go to the end of the 2,000 amot on Erev Shabbat, and you would put food at that point, so that later you could come back on Shabbat, and you would be able to walk from that point on another 2,000 amot. It's as if you're making your shvut, like as if you're making your residence for Shabbat at that point. So then you get another 2,000 amot in that direction. It means, by the way, also that you can't walk. Let's say you did that. That's the maximum, right? So let's say you have the city. Let's say this is your city. So you can walk, let's say, 2,000 amot in any direction around the city. Maybe I'll do this on a little whiteboard. Just a second.
Wasn't there something like this with the Seir Lazazel when the Adam
Yes.
Isha Iti had to walk to the desert, and there was some trick excuse
Yeah.
so that it could go farther away into the desert than the 2,000 amot.
Yes, it's something we discussed back then.
Mm.
So let's say, hold on a second. Oh, it doesn't matter. We'll just go with however this works. Let's say, pardon my drawing. Let's say each of the red lines represents 2,000 amot in each direction outside of the city. And let's say, so let's say this is north, south, east, and west. And let's say you needed to go, 4,000 amot east for some kind of a mitzvah. Maybe you had to be at a Brit Milah that was 4,000 amot outside of the city. So what you would do is on Erev Shabbat, you would go and we'll make the eruv this green color. You put your eruv here, and then that will give you another 2,000 amot in this direction, right? Because when you put, the idea is again that you're making food. Food is related to this idea of your shvut. That's where you rest, is where you have your food, because you're supposed to eat meals on Shabbat. Once you do that, once you've set up your eruv tchum in this direction, then you can walk 4,000 amot in this direction. But it also means that now you can no longer go 2,000 amot in the opposite direction. Right? You've pulled your 2,000 amot here to the east. You've taken it away from the west. Okay. that's the basic idea of the Eruv Tchum. If you needed to go 3,000 amot, you could put your Eruv here and just do another 1,000, and you'd still be allowed to do 1,000 in the other direction. But we don't have to get into all of the details of that. What we're concerned about here is this definition of how much food you're supposed to put. So, ketzad mishtatfin batchumin, meniach et chavit, ve'omer. You put a barrel, or you take your food, you put it in the chavit, you put it at the point, that you want your extension to begin from on Erev Shabbat. Arei zeh l'chol b'nei iri. You say, this is for anybody in my city. L'chol mi she'elech lebeita ha'evel or lebeita mishteh. In other words, for anybody who needs to go for a particular purpose in this direction. L'chol shekibel alav mibod yom mutar. And then anybody who accepts upon themselves to rely on this Eruv on when it's still Erev Shabbat, mibod yom, while it's still day on Friday, then mutar, then they're allowed to rely on this Eruv to continue walking on Shabbat. Mishetech shach, but if they only accepted the Eruv after it already got dark on Shabbat, asur, then they're not allowed to go any further. Shein ma'arvin mishetech shach. You're not allowed to make an Eruv once it's dark. Okay. Kama hu shiuro. This is the part that we're mainly trying to get to. So what's the shiur? In other words, how much food do you have to put in this chavit in order to activate the Eruv Tchumim? So mazon shtei suudot kol echad. You have to put enough food for 2 suudot, for 2 meals, for each person. Each person who wants to take advantage of this Eruv Tchum has to have 2 suudot for each of them. And how much is that? Mizono lechol v'lo l'shabbat. It's the amount that they'll eat for a meal during the week, and not on Shabbos. Divrei Rebbe Meir. Rebbe Meir says the way we measure the sudot, it's the amount that you eat in a sudah of chol, and not on Shabbos. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer the Shabbat v'lo l'chol. He says the opposite. We measure the sudah amount based on how much you would eat on Shabbat and not on chol. And the Mishnah comments, "V'zeh v'zeh mitkavnim lahakel." Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are intending to be makil here. So what's the idea? The Bartanur explains, right? El ve'el mitkavnim lahakel. Rabbi Meir savar b'Shabbat achil enash tfei mishum devasim tavshilei. Rabbi Meir holds that people eat more, they eat more bread on Shabbos because their food is spicier. And Rabbi Yehuda holds, Kevanta b'Shabbat achil shalosh sudot, Rabbi Yehuda holds, since on Shabbos you're going to eat 3 meals, you don't eat that much in each meal. This is a lesson for all of us. Ushtei sudot shel chol. So according to him, 2 sudot of during the week, habitvei mishtei sudot shel Shabbat. Okay. So this is Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and each of them holds that you put in 2 sudot, and they both have in mind essentially the same idea, but they had different ideas about how people eat on Shabbos as opposed to chol. Now we get something a little more specific. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka omer mikikar b'fundyon me'arba si'in b'sela. So this is a much more specific shiur. He says you put in enough that if you had a kikar a loaf that was sold for a pundion based on a market rate where there were 4 sa'ah of flour that you would buy for a sela. Okay, so this is why I gave you that other page, which I'll bring up now. And we're going to do a little bit of math. Okay. So first of all, because especially Paul, I know you like to know how much things are. So a sa'ah, 1 sa'ah is measured in the measures of Chazal as 6 kav. And in terms of measurements today, according to the Rambam, 1 sa'ah is 7.34 liters. So that's a lot, right? In other words, you have think if you have flour, you have basically like 7.5 liters of flour. That makes a lot of bread. So 1 sa'ah equals 6 kav. So 4 sa'ah, of course, is 24 kav. That would be, a lot more. That would be what, almost 30 liters. Based on that, and then the other relative measures we need to know are kav, 1 kav equals 24 beitzim. So therefore, a quarter of a kav equals 6 beitzim. Okay, so these are the volumetric measures that we're dealing with. If we start with 4 sa'ah, we would get 24 kav, and okay, we'll come back to these in a minute. Now, in terms of the coinage, 1 sela equals 4 dinarim, which equals 24 me'im, which equals 48 pundionim, right? Pundion was the smallest denomination. 1 ma'ah equals 2 pundion. Okay, now, so what did our Mishnah say? Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says the amount for the Suda, for the 2 Sudot, would be from a kikar that sold for a pundion. That was a kikar that was made based on a price of 4 se'im that was sold for 1 seva. Is everybody with me so far? It goes like this.
He's mixing quantities here.
Well, not exactly. In other words, it's like, think of it like this. If you, how much does a loaf of bread cost? So let's say, if you're buying, if you're buying bread wholesale, if you think of it, you have to think of it, let's say from from a grocer's point of view or the baker's point of view. So baker, let's say he's going to base his price of each kikar, each loaf is going to be based on this price. That if you had 1 second. Oof. Oh, here. Arba se'in basela. So if the base price is you had 4 se'in of flour, you had 4 se'in of flour that was going to make bread, right? And let's say we'll see each loaf is a standard size that's going to be a fraction of a sa'ah. So if you had 4 sa'ah, and you'll see why he starts off with 4 sa'in, because it's going to work out, the math will work out more easily. Let's see if I can line this up again. Hold on. Going back and forth. See, it's like this. Remember what we said here in the beginning. If you have one sa'ah is 6 kav. 4 sa'ah is 24 kabin. 1 sela is 24 me'in. So the reason this is going to get set up is with 4 sa'ah is because it's going to be easier for me now to understand the relationship between a kav to a half a me'ah, which is going to be a punyon. See what I'm saying? So if 1 sela buys 4 se'in, that means 1 sela buys 24 kabin. That means 1 me'ah buys 1 kav of bread. That means half of that, 1 punyon, is going to buy a half of a kav. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says, Kikar hanimkar bepundion, a loaf of bread that's sold for 1 pundion. So how much bread is that? How much does that work out to be? How big a loaf is that going to be? So the formula is going to be a half, right? So we know that, like we just set it up here, a pundion is going to buy a half of a kav. So a half of a kav, but really it's going to be a half of a kav minus a half. In other words, you have to take that half of a kav and divide it in half for reasons that the Bartanura explained, which is in order for the baker to make a profit, he has to take away 50% to cover his expenses. And so he can make a little bit of profit. So a kikar that's sold for 1 pundion, in principle, pays for a half of a kav, but in reality, the customer is going to get a quarter of a kav. And 1/4 of a kav, as a volumetric measure, is 6 beitzim. So what does it mean for us? It means that kikar nimkar b'fundion, when it's 4 sa'ah b'sela, it means that the size of the amount of the eruv for the 2 sudot is going to be 6 beitzim. That's Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Let's look at the Bartanuri here. I know this is getting a little technical, but bear with me. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says, Kikar b'fundion, Kikar halakuach b'fundion, right? So a loaf of bread that's purchased for 1 pundion, kishemochrin arba sin chlitin l'seva, when the price of 4 se'in of wheat costs 1 sela, the arba'a se'in, and so 4 se'in is 24 kabin, as I showed you in my little chart. The sela is esrim v'arba me'in. The sela equals 24 me'in. Nimsa kav l'chol ma'a. So it means that each kav costs 1 ma'a, and 1 ma'a is 2 punyon. 2 punyonim. Hare, therefore, kikar nimkar b'shuk b'fundion, a loaf of bread that's sold in the shuk for 1 pundion is a half of a kav. But the seller, the grocer, he takes half of that as payment for the baking and for the grinding, and it's for his expenses. Nimtza, so it turns out, kikar lakuach minachen vani bifundion. So it means that in terms of the final price to the customer, what he buys for 1 pundion is going to be reva kav. It's going to be a quarter of a kav, shehem shesh beitzim, which is 6 beitzim, which is what I just showed you on my little list there. How do I know that? Shekav esrim ve'arba beitzim, because 1 kav is 24, so a quarter, 1 kav is 24 beitzim, so a quarter of a kav is going to be 6 beitzim. V'heim shiur shtei su'udot shel eruv v'divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, v'halacha kamota. Halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. So all of this to say that when you make an eruv tchum, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, everybody holds you have to put an amount of 2 su'udot. So he says, this is the amount of 2 su'udot. It's going to be the amount of bread, like 2 loaves of bread, where each of them is going to be 3 beitzim. Or a kikar that's 6 beitzim. That's mazon shtei su'udot. We also have the Daya of Rabbi Shimon, who disagrees, but not by much. But he has a different calculation. Rabbi Shimon omer shtei yadot l'chikar mishalosh l'kav. He measures it a little differently. He says 2 parts. In other words, it'll be 2 parts, 2/3 of a loaf mishalosh l'kav. When you get 3 kikarot to 1 kav. Now remember, a kav. Let's go back and look at our little chart here. Where did I put it? 1 kikar, he says, so 1 kikar is 1/3 of a kav. Remember, 1 kav is 24 beitzim. If I have 1/3 of a kav, that's 8 beitzim. So if I take 2/3 of a kikar, that's 8 beitzim, right? So if 1 kikar, which equals 1/3 of a kav, equals 8 beitzim, and I take 2/3 of that, that's 2/3 times 8, equals 5 1/3 beitzim. So his measure for 2 su'udot is 5 1/3 beitzim. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says the 2 su'udot are 6 beitzim, and Rabbi Shimon says it's 5 1/3 beitzim. Okay, that's our math lesson for today. Right, Rabbi Shimon mema'et b'shiur. He reduces the shiur for this shtei su'udot. V'omer shedai la'arei b'shtei yadot shel kikar shel shlosha kikarot lekav. He said it's enough to make this eruv tchum with a loaf that's kikar shel shlosha kikarot lekav. 1 kikar, that would be 1/3 of a kav. In other words, one kikar that was made as 1/3 of a kav. So the kav is 24 beitzim. I'm going to make a kikar that's 1/3 of that. That's 8 beitzim. And then I'm going to take 2/3 of that. So that's going to be 5 1/3. The kikar shalem shel shmona beitzim u'shlishi takav. Right, a whole loaf based on that, is going to be 8 beitzim, which is a third of the kav. Ushtei yudotah, 2/3 of it, 2 measures of that. Shehem chamesh beitzim v'yoter. It's 5 and a little more. Havu shtei sudot. Okay, that's maybe a little bit more than we had to do, but it's okay. So that's the whole point here of this Mishnah is to tell us so far is just to define how much bread do I have to, or how much of a sudah, how big does my sudah have to be? In other words, how much food do I have to put in my eruv tchum for 2 sudat? So basically, we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. He says it's going to be 6 beitzim, and we have Rabbi Shimon says it's 5 1/3 beitzim. And then the Mishnah goes on to add in more information that's not immediately important for Eruvim, but it's related. It's because we're talking about these shurim. It says Chetzia l'bayit menuga, right? Rashi quoted this part of the Mishnah. Half of that is the shear for bayit menuga. The chetzia, half of a half, lifso atagvia. So what do these things mean? Chetzia l'bayit menuga. So we learn in halacha about bayit menuga, right? So what if you have a house that gets negatzarat? So one of the things we learn one of the things we learn, the Torah tells us, "Hashochev b'bayit yichabes et bigadav, v'ha'ochel b'bayit yichabes et bigadav." So if somebody lies down in a bayit menuga, then they become an av tuma to be metamei their begadim. And it also says ochel b'bayit, if you eat in a bayit menuga, yichabes et bigadav, you also become an av tuma, and then you're metamei kelim, which would include your clothes. So Chazal understood ochel b'bayit was telling me a shear of time it takes to eat. You have to be inside of the house the time it takes to eat. So this is where the Bartunu explains. Chetzi l'bayit menuga, stam matnitinhi. This is the stam Mishnah. In other words, after we had this machloket between Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and Rabbi Shimon about the shear of the Suda, now we're just saying, stam, a kule alma, this is a halacha in Bayit HaMenuga, v'hachikama, chatzi, so chatzia, half of whatever kikar we learned earlier, half of that is going to be a measure for Bayit HaMenuga. What does that mean? Hachikama, chatzi kikar shalem, sheshiurubo, bein lamar uvein lamar. Half of a whole loaf that's measured whether to this one or whether that one. Whether it's the shear that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka used or the shear of Rabbi Shimon, half of their kikar, that's the shiur, the shehiyat bayit menuga. That's the shiur for how long it takes for you to become tamei in a bayit menuga. Let's flesh that out a little more. What does it mean? Shanichnas bayit sheyesh bo negat zarat. Afal pishu tamei miyad. If you walk into a bayit minuga, you immediately become tamei. But afal pishu tamei miyad eino ta'um kibus bgadim ad sheyesheh kedei achila. You only become tamei to be metamei kelim if you're in the house long enough to eat. And what does that mean? Half of the kikar that we defined as being the amount that you need for a roof tchum, so half of that which is either going to be 4 beitzim according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, or half of 5 1/3 according to Rabbi Shimon. The time it takes to eat that's how long it takes for you, if that's how long you have to be in a bayit menuga before you're matamei kelim. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka damar kikar shalem habi reva kav shem shisha beitzim. What did I say? 4. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, who says a whole loaf is a quarter of a kav, which is 6 beitzim. So then nimtza chetzia shalosh beitzim. So then that tells me that chetzia, half of that is going to be 3 beitzim. V'hu pras. The Bechulei Talmuda. That's the pras that in the entire Talmud, when it talks about Kedei Achilat pras, that's what it means. In other words, it's half of a loaf. And according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, that's going to be the amount of time it takes to eat 3 beitzim, right? Rabbi Shimon damar kikar shalem hu shel shlishit hakav shehem shmoneh beitzim. According to Rabbi Shimon, who says that a full loaf is 1/3 of a kav, which is 8 beitzim. So then abichetzia arba beitzim, half of that will be 4 beitzim. Who pras the bikulei Talmud alibid Rabbi Shimon. Kedei achilat pras that's mentioned throughout the Talmud, according to Rabbi Shimon, is going to be the time it takes to eat 4 beitzim. The af al gab, the Rabbi Shimon savar, the bikikar shalem yesh shalosh suudot. Even though, according to Rabbi Shimon, a whole kikar then, right? Because what did he say? He says you need mazon shtei sudot. A whole kikar is going to be because yesh shalosh sudot. Daha shtei yudotea ka'amar Rabbi Shimon dahavi shtei sudot. 2/3 of a kikar is enough for 2 sudot. So 3/3 is going to be enough for 3 sudot. Hane mili be'eruv. That's only applicable in the area of eruv. To do kavnubo lahakel, because the kavanah there was to be makil on how much you have to bring. Ein tzarich shtei sudot shleimot. You don't need 2 full sudot. But in all other areas, in all other places, Rabbi Shimon holds otherwise. A suda is defined as being not less than a half of a kikar of 1/3 of a kav. Okay, I don't have to explain that any further, but just understand that what it means is we're defining here. The whole point here is we're defining here what it means kedei achilat pras, and the idea, the relevance of the bayit menugas. That's the source. This is where we get the idea of that eating a certain amount defines a shiur of time. That's the way Chazal understand this pasuk, where it says "Ha'ochel b'bayit yichabesit b'gadav," it doesn't mean literally if you eat in the house that's a bayit minuga, that then you're mitamei begadim. It means if you stay in the house long enough to eat, then you're mechabes begadim, right? So like Rashi, like the Bartanura said, you're tamei as soon as you go in, but you're not tamei to be mitamei begadim, to be mitamei kelim, unless you stay in long enough to eat. And how is that defined? It's defined as being half as much food that you would have to leave for your Eruv Tchum. That's why it's brought down in the Mishnah in Eruvin. And then there's one more halacha, b'chatzi chetzia. So again, we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. He says mazon shtei sudot is 6 beitzim. And we had Rabbi Shimon who says mazon shtei sudot is 2/3 of a kikar that's of 8 beitzim, so that's 5 1/3 beitzim. Half of that is going to be the amount of food that you would eat. 3 beitzim, 3 beitzim according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, and 4 beitzim according to Rabbi Shimon. The amount of time it takes to eat either 3 beitzim or 4 beitzim, that's the amount of time that you would have to be inside of a bayit menuga in order to be metamei bigadim. And then half of that, chatzi chatzia, half of the half, is enough for you to eat lifsol atagbiya. What does that mean? The ha'ochel ochalim tmeim. If you eat food that's tamei, that's this amount of half of a pras. Nifsal gufo midrabanan milachol bitruma. What it means to be nifsol etagbiya literally means to be right, to void, to be posel, or to render pasul the inside of your body. What it means is if you eat ochel tamei, you've rendered your body pasul from eating truma, midirabanan. It's a gzeira midirabanan. V'chatzi pras, havi beitzo mechzav Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Half of a pras is 1.5 eggs to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Ushtei beitzim Rabbi Shimon. That's a volumetric measure. In other words, that's how much food that you would have to eat of tamei in order to make yourself pasul from eating any truma. So all of these things are linked, and they're linked here in this Mishnah in Eruvin. So I hope this brought a little bit of clarity, but I got to tell you, it's a lot to take in. But let's go back now and just see what the point is here. So again, in the context of the Gemara, does everybody see the Gemara now?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Hold on. This one. Maskifla Rava, right? So here in our Gemara, what's at stake here is we're trying to work out these concepts of eating and drinking on Yom Kippur as being absolute measures as opposed to relative measures. So Rava says there's another aspect to this, which is not just the amount of food we're eating, but the amount of time that we need to eat the food within in order to be chayav. So, k'zayit b'chtei achilat pras, kotevet b'chtei achilat pras? So does it make sense that in all other Isurei Torah, I'm only chayav, I'm going to be chayav for eating a kazayit of Isur if I eat it b'chtei achilat pras, the time it takes me to eat a pras. And now we, having looked at the Mishnah in Eruvin, I understand there's a machloket about exactly how big that pras is. But Bein the Rabbi Yochanan, Bein the Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Bein the Rabbi Shimon, you need to eat. They're going to say that a pras is X. Either it's going to be 3 beitzim or it's going to be 4 beitzim. So the time it takes to eat either 3 beitzim or 4 beitzim, I have to eat a kazayit of isur in that amount of time in order to be chayav for eating that isur. The Torah is not mechayevet oti unless I ate that amount within that amount of time. So how could it be that the Torah is also mechayevet oti for eating a kotevet, a much larger shiur, in the same amount of time? The much larger shiur of food, I would have guessed, would indicate that I have more time to eat it, during which I could become chayav. So Abaye says to Rava, no, Kimlu Rabbanan Debachim Yad V'Date. Again, what the Torah is concerned about when it comes to eating on Yom Kippur is not about eating stam. It's not simply about eating. It's about eating enough to give you Yishuv Hadat. So yes, you have to eat more in that same space of time that you would have for any other Isur in order for you to have Yishuv Hadat. B'tfei mehachi, but more than that time, if you eat it over a longer period of time, lo miyat v'date, it's not going to be miyashev dat. I'm going to read through this Rashi again and finish the Rashis. Then I think that'll be it for tonight. So, Kazayit b'chtei achiyat pras, Kimlan b'chol otani surim sheshiran b'kazayit. So, it's established for us that in all of those isurim that are measured by a kazayit, shim shaha bein tchilat achilat hashir l'gemar achilat yoter b'chtei achiyat pras. If you waited from the beginning of eating that shiur until you finished eating that shiur more than the time it takes to eat a pras, ein mitzaref, then what you ate doesn't join together to make a shiur for which you're chayav. Kol shiur b'toch kadei shiyat suda. And so what is that amount of time? Hi achirat chatzi kikar sheshiuru bo ata eruv. It's the time it takes to eat half of a loaf that Chazal measured the eruv, the amount that you need to put in an eruv. And how much is that? Humazon shtei suda. The amount that you need to put in the eruv is the amount it takes to eat 2 sudot. Kiditnan, like we learned in the Mishnah in Eruvin, chetzia l'bayta menuga. Half of the shiur that you need for eruv is the time that it takes for you to become tamei in a bayit menuga, in order to be the tamei kelim. Shetalah hakatuv shehiatol l'tamei begadim b'shiur achila. The Torah attached the idea of how long it takes for you to become tamei, to be tamei begadim, to the time it takes to eat. That is, to eat a su'udah, and we define the amount of a Suda in Eruvin. The amount of Suda in Eruvin is going to be Chatzi Kikar. It's going to be a Kikar, and then it's going to be half of that for Baita Benuga, and that's the shiur of time. Kikotevet Bichdei Achilat Pras. This is still part of Rava's kasha. It's his question. How could it be that a kikotevet, that I need to eat a kikotevet also in this limited amount of time? Kidei achilat pras bitmiya, right? This is, I'm asking it as a question. Yoma Kippurim sheshiur achilato b'kikotevet afu shiuro l'tziruf achilato b'chdei achilat pras. On Yom Kippur, where the shear for eating is much larger than a regular isur, it's a kikotevet, but the shear for the amount of time it takes to eat it, it's siruf achiloto, to join together your eating into, as it were, one eating. That's also bichdei achilat pras. Vim shahayoter mikan. If you waited longer than that to finish your kikotevet, ein mitztaref, then whatever you started eating before isn't mitztaref to what you ate later, and you're patur. You won't be chayav for eating on Yom Kippur. V'hakevan d'shiuro gadol b'yishiyat ve'letziruf achilato. And since its shear, the shear for eating on Yom Kippur, is larger than other shiurim of isur, you would think it needs a longer amount of time, or you would have a longer amount of time for it to be mitztaref. In other words, I should have made the time based, I could have made a ratio, I could have made it relative to the size. If I eat a kazayit b'toch kedei achilat pras, and a kikotevet, let's say, for the sake of argument, is twice as big. So I should say kikotevet in the time it takes to eat a kikar, which is twice a pras. V'hashta kula havi depatrile. Now it's going to be a kula that I'm poteroto for eating it in, in the, for having a shorter amount of time. In other words, I should have been mechayev him even if it takes longer to eat the kikotevet. But what you're saying now is that the Torah is poteroto for eating it, for eating in a lesser amount of time. So Abaye says, right? The Rabbanim B'Hacham Yad V'Date, B'Tfei Mehachi Im Shaha Yoter Mikan. If he waited longer than Kedei Achit Pras to eat his kikotevet, lo miyad v'date. It doesn't give him yishuv hadat. Yoma Kippurim b'yishuv hadat tal yamilta. Yom Kippur is all about yishuv hadat, right? Literally, a davar tole, right? Talui, right? The whole thing is dependent on the idea of yishuv hadat. The ichtiv asher lo tzudah, the nefesh that's not afflicted, right, is going to be chayav karet. So it's all about yishuv hadat. So that's the conclusion. It's all about yishuv hadat.
Sure.
Yes.
How can you measure the time by the time it takes you to eat some, let's say, a loaf?
Yeah.
On Yom Kippur, you are not allowed to eat. So how will you measure it?
But that, in other words, that's just a measure of time. So however,
yes, but you are not allowed to eat to see how long it is.
Yeah, but you can know that from any other day of the week. How
but
long?
Now you are here. Yesterday you ate a loaf. You have a feeling, but that's not exact.
Well, you
wouldn't say it's
trying to say
5 minutes or something like this.
No, but people.
But do you remember that if I tell you 5 minutes, do you know? No, you have no watch, nothing. How do you
First
know
of all,
what
first of all, you also have other ways of measuring time, even without a watch. So let's say it's the time it takes for your hourglass to go down. Let's say you have an hourglass that that you use the time for making your eggs, and it takes the time it takes for the sand to go through your hourglass is the same
so
amount of time it takes you to eat 3 beitzim.
so you have to do an experiment the day before to know how many times you have to keep to how do you say your hourglass until the next shiur.
Yeah.
Or
So
maybe
if you
it's only in a half. I don't know.
so no, here's the thing. If you remember, a long time ago, we looked already at the Mishnah Brura and the Aruch HaShulchan about
By
this.
the way, did they have this hourglasses? Did they have such a thing? That there
Honestly,
were.
honestly, I don't know, but
Mhm.
there are I'll tell you what I think, and I'm only basing this on, partly from my own observation and partly just thinking about it. So I'm not saying this is an absolute proof. I think at a time before there were clocks, people had a more sensitive relationship to time than we have. And I think all of us are old enough to remember what it was like before we had digital clocks everywhere. And we know about how long things take. And we have already a certain sensitivity because even before we had digital clocks, but we had clocks. And before the age of clocks, I assume that people knew, by looking in the sky what time of day it is. You can tell by the length of a shadow, how much time has passed. There are other ways of measuring time, not necessarily down to a microsecond or even down to seconds, but that's the way people measured time. They must speak. I maybe nowadays we go a little bit overboard because we have all this digital equipment. But I think the point is this idea of measuring the achilat pras, that was something that people knew how long it takes to eat a meal.
How long is it in time today?
So what I mentioned is we looked at this, and there are different opinions in Achronim that range from, let's say, roughly between like 5 minutes to 9 minutes. And the reason that for the variation is it also has to do with different opinions of how much a beitzah is, right? Because remember the kedei achilat pras, let's say it's the time it takes to eat 3 beitzim. So depends on how big you think a beitzah is, right? We know there's a machloket about how you measure the size of a kibetza.
How
But
do
let's
we eat it? Is it a hard betza, soft betza? It's
but
not the
also
same
remember
time.
kibetza is a
Betza
volume.
ein, I don't know.
Is it a deviled egg? Is it no? But remember the kibetza is just the size, because you could also eat 3 kibetzim of chocolate, or you could eat 3 kibetzim of lettuce, or you could eat 3 kibetzim of whatever. The kibetza is just a volumetric measure.
If you eat
So
a betza, a matzah, very dry matzah, it's going to take you a longer time.
well, this is an interesting thing. How long do you have to eat your matzah on Leil HaSeder? And this is something that people started to become really machmir about, beginning about 50 years ago. when all of a sudden, uh, it used to be that people, you would people didn't necessarily measure. They knew how much, they would have their piece of matzah, and everybody knew that you had to eat like about this much, and you sat and you ate it. Nobody was sitting there with a watch thinking, but nowadays people do that. People say, well, it has to be exactly this much, and we have to set the timer so that, or you have to look
And
at the
that choking, yes.
yeah, so I mean I'm sorry, it's a little bit crazy. But I think the whole point is that these are measurements that were accessible to everybody, right? They didn't have watches, they didn't have necessarily scales that they had such a thing as scales, but not everybody has a scale at home to measure exactly. But they know about how much three kibetzim are, and they know about how long that takes to eat. And so, that's how long you have. And here, Linyan Isur, for the Isur of eating on Yom Kippur, then it's going to be that you're allowed, that if you have a kikotevet, pras, so then you're chayav. The reason it's really, the main reason for us that it's a relevant shiur, excuse me, 1 second. Is not so much because we're trying to eat on Yom Kippur and not be chayav karet, but rather in those instances where people have to eat on Yom Kippur, and this is a sugya that we're still going to get into, if the medical advice is that you can eat a certain amount within a certain amount of time, and that's okay. So that's what we call on Yom Kippur eating, eating the shiurim. So if let's say your doctor tells you have to eat on Yom Kippur, it's like then it's asur for you to not eat. But we might say is we'll ask the doctor, how much do you have to eat? So there's sometimes for some people, depending on their medical condition, they'll say you have to eat normally. Otherwise, you could end up in the hospital and die. But for other people, it might say, as long as you eat a little from time to time, that's okay. Then you'll be okay. So then we'll say, okay, so then you'll eat less than a kikotevet bichdei achilat pras. So let's say kedei achilat pras, for the sake of argument, is let's say it's 7 minutes. So we'll say, okay, you'll eat your kikotevet, but you'll take 8 minutes to eat it. You won't eat it all at once. You'll take 8 minutes. So then you didn't need a kikotevet bichdei achilat pras. So determining exactly the length of kedei achilat pras becomes an important halachic issue. My personal sense is that based on everything that we've seen, again, I there's more to say about it, but I think the sense of time at a time before there were clocks is inherently a different sense of time. You see the way they think about it. How did they measure time? The time it takes to eat such and such. So maybe that was also not an absolute measure. Maybe that was a relative measure. Maybe that meant like what you were alluding to a moment ago, Paul. Maybe it means that on Erev Yom Kippur, you have to sit down and get a sense of how long it takes for you to eat 3 kibetzim of food. And then, if you have to eat on Yom Kippur, you'll know that you have to eat your kikotevet in a longer period of time.
I have a suggestion. If you
Okay.
want to have a good measure of time without
Yeah.
clock,
Yeah.
so you could say the time it takes me to sing this Mizmor Teilim with Tameh Mikra. So you could try it the day before, and then you have a good memory of the tempo you used that time.
You know,
People usually
that's like what they said, you know, when they were telling everybody to wash their hands during Corona. They said it, you know, in America, they said, what was it, the time it takes you to sing happy
Happy
birthday through,
birthday.
what was it?
Happy birthday, yeah.
Yeah, it was like that time it takes to sing happy birthday or that, whatever it was. So, yeah, but remember, you're going to be eating, so you can't be singing and eating at the same time. My person, again, my person,
I shall eat and you will sing.
what if you're by yourself? But don't agid. But the point is, I think ultimately these are things that people do b'chush. You get a sense of how long it takes, you know, how long it takes for you to eat.
You can sing mentally inside your head. It's okay.
You could also do that. Yeah. There are ways of measuring time. There are ways of measuring time. Anyway, this whole part of the Gemara, though, it's very interesting because there is this. You see that Rava keeps coming back to this idea of Kiblahu Rabbanan, and that there is such a thing as there is such a thing as absolute measure. There is such a thing as relative measure, and sometimes relative measure is Masha Kovea, and sometimes it's the absolute measure is Kovea. And my feeling is there's probably, you know, you could go more into it, and maybe we'll have more insight as we continue on in the Gemara. But next time we're going to start into the next part of the Sugya. I think that's it for tonight. So I hope I was able to clarify. I spent a long time trying to clarify these few lines in Rashi, but I feel obliged to try to make it as clear as possible. But it's a lot to take in. So if you have time, you could look it over again. We'll see you next week in any event. Hopefully by next week I'll know where I'm moving.
You will move back?
I'm moving here in Yerushalayim.
Ah,
I
you are
have to
moving? You
I
have
have
to leave your flat, your apartment?
yes. I have
But
to
you have a
vacate.
very long time there. Yeah.
I've been here for 14 plus years.
Mhm.
But
So where do you move to?
I haven't figured it out yet because the
You
last
have
few
no, no, no.
I had the last few weeks I was preoccupied in writing a Megillat Esther before Purim,
Mhm.
and then I told Michael that beginning on Motzei Shabbat I was sick, and it's only today that I actually started making some inquiries. But I've been looking at listings, and I'm probably going to go to, I think, Kiryat Yovel or that area. Although I did also look in Arnona. I've been looking at some listings there also. But hopefully I'll figure it out by next week. Hopefully I'll figure it out before Shabbat, actually. I'd like to settle on something, but we'll see what I can do. So that's it for tonight. And Bezrat Hashem, Namshich Allah.
יישר
Okay.
כוח. יישר
Thank
כוח.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night. Feel
Bye-bye.
well.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.